What's up, folks? Professor Hevert here with a video that's gonna touch my heart a little bit. And here's what I want to do. I want to talk about what history is, because I think that there are a lot of misconceptions about what the discipline is, what we do, how a historian goes about their work. I think we have some things to clear up. So let me start with a story. And this story is about me. In high school, when I first went to college, you're not going to believe this, but I hated history. I thought it was boring. I didn't get it. Now, I had a pretty good teacher my sophomore year. Like, he was cool, but wasn't perhaps the best teacher. And the only thing I remember from AP English is our teacher liked to insult communists and made us read a Stephen Ambrose book about Lewis and Clark called Undaunted Courage. The single most boring book I have ever read in my life. In fact, I gave up after 20 pages. It was so dull. And even when I went to community college, which is something I did, the class I took there was a lot more of the same. I just didn't understand what was going on. Like, I mean, some of the subjects were cool. Like, I loved learning about ancient Rome. That was neat. But I didn't walk out of that class knowing really what a historian did or why history was important. I just knew it was kind of there. And here's what I encountered. And I bet this is what you might have encountered in the past too. It felt like I had to memorize a whole bunch of stuff. Names, dates, important events. And I'm good at that sort of stuff, but it takes a lot of effort to remember so much. And having exams that that you don't know what's on it, and it was tough business. Now, eventually, through a whole bunch of cosmic intervention, let's say, I ended up becoming a historian. And what I learned along the way is not that history is really the friends that you've made along the way, but it's a different sort of thing than I thought. And let's make this a little bit more concrete, right? So I'm going to show you a picture right now that is probably going to make your skin crawl. Hold on one second. I bet this is what you saw. Something like this, where you've got all of these dates on the left-hand side. You've got all of these big events on the right-hand side. Or perhaps it looks something like this. And maybe you think that what historians do is sit down, memorize all of these dates, and quiz each other, and that's how somebody does history. Well, that's not how somebody does history. Believe me, if all it took to get a PhD was sitting down and being quizzed on dates, it would have taken me a lot less time. But we don't do these things. In fact, I'll admit it, oftentimes I gotta Google a range of dates. And I have an advanced degree in this subject. What this kind of history, well, I won't even call it history, but what this brings to the table is boring. It's just boring. There's no other way to put it. There's no investment here. You can't look at that list of dates and list of events and names and important people and think, I'm invested in this. This is a really interesting story. Because it's not a story. It's just a list of things. That's not compelling. It just isn't. So, I guess the question is then, well, why should you care about history? I've seen a lot of my own students write things down in discussion posts about, well, the past is the past. We should focus on the future. Or I don't know how this helps me in my career. Or I would rather take another class in my actual major than have to take history because I don't like it or I don't see its use. And I could give you a whole bunch of kind of BS sounding reasons why you should take history or why you should care about it. You should take history because we teach you critical thinking skills. Well, guess what? So does every other discipline in college. You learn critical thinking skills in English, in math, in biology. They're all there. They all do it. So I can't really give you that reason. I could give you quotes, right? Like some famous ones, especially those who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it. And I don't want to give you that quote because I don't necessarily believe that history really repeats itself. It might rhyme, it might seem familiar. There are patterns in history for sure, but is it a one-for-one replication? That's a hard thing to argue. I could tell you that history was written by the victors, right? And all of that kind of nonsense. History isn't always written by the victors, and it's good that it isn't. So let me give you my reason why you should care about history. And it's quite simple. Believe it or not. Why should you care about history? Because history is about you. And I mean that in both the individual sense and the collective sense. History is the story of who we are. Everything that we experience now, who we are now, and what will shape us in the future comes from the past. What makes the past so interesting and so dynamic is that it's the biggest frame of time that we can conceive of. We don't know how long the future is. We don't know how long our species is going to survive, or our planet is going to survive, or anything like that. The future's no guarantee. An asteroid could hit us tomorrow. But the past, that we can get into. And what we realize as soon as we start looking into the past and thinking of our own selves as a product of that past, history becomes more meaningful. When you understand that decisions that were made before your time led to the experience that you are having in life in the present, history becomes much more personal. It becomes more a part of the story of who you are and where you come from. And if there's anything that human beings crave over anything else, it's the knowledge of oneself, understanding one's place in the world, maybe our purpose, maybe the thing that we want to most fix or understand. And when you look at history from this way, I think that's why you need to know it. And maybe that still sounds like BS to you, and I get it. I totally get it. History's not going to, in and of itself, help you get a job. We're going to teach you some skills that could be useful in the workplace, sure, but this isn't about getting a job. This is about knowing who you are, knowing your values, knowing what matters to you. History can show you those things. And if you're like, well, I don't know about that, Professor Hever, like, history is just the story of old guys doing old guy stuff. And I don't blame you for thinking that, because again, that's kind of what you've been taught. But let me show you a list. And I think this will illuminate some things for you. This list is just a small example of the variety of history. We can frame the past in terms of a time frame. We can frame it geographically. We can frame it around concepts like race, gender, popular culture. The past is a playfield. It is an absolute playground for us to look into and find ourselves. It can explain just about anything if you know how to look and if you know what you're doing. And why I think historians need to be a little bit better at communicating to students what exactly we do. When you come out of a biology class or a chemistry class, let's say, you probably have a really good understanding of what a biologist or a chemist does. But I get the feeling, and I've seen the evidence, that when somebody walks out of a history class, they don't know what a historian does or what the discipline is designed to do. This list is a beginning of organizing some of our knowledge. But this isn't it. History is dynamic. It must be diverse. It must consider all these different perspectives. And that means that we have to really look at a key distinction that's really going to undergird our understanding of what history is. And here's what I mean. Let's make this distinction: the past and history. And if you're thinking, aren't they the same thing? I get it, but let me tell you why they're different. The past is that timeline, right? If we go back and we look at these dates, that's the past. Those things happened on those dates. We know that they happened. We have evidence that they happened, or we experienced them ourselves, something along those lines. That's the past. It's not very exciting. History is that study of the past. It's a way of looking at what evidence is available and trying to make meaning out of what we find. And hey, look, if the ultimate question is who am I? Or who are we as a species, as human beings? The necessary consequence of asking who am I and who are we as people is we have to look for meaning where meaning isn't readily understandable. We need to look at things that happen in our lives and we need to say, this has a reason, whether this is the reason why it happened or these are the consequences of those things happening, that it gave us some sort of utility, some sort of meaning that animates who we are, how we see the world and our beliefs. If we don't have the ability to make meaning, then we're just experiencing things from moment to moment. That doesn't allow us a whole lot of self-reflection. History is a way of making meaning out of things that on the surface may not seem like they have any meaning. We look at those dates, we look at those events, and we try to figure out a whole bunch of different stuff about it. We try to figure out what caused things, what the consequences were, how did it shape the lives of certain people. And that's what makes it really interesting. So think of history as a way of knowing something about the past. And let me give you a fancy word to help really kind of bring this together. And that word is epistemology. Epistemology is a fancy way of saying this is how we know what we know. Every discipline, every subject that you take in school has a different way of constructing knowledge so that human beings can glean meaning from it. English, literature, it has its own way of knowing. History has its own way of knowing. Sociology has its own way of knowing. Political science does. And the methods for how we know what we know in those fields depends on the different disciplines as well. So there's something about history. History constructs knowledge about the past through a number of different methods, but it ultimately comes down to some basic sense of principles. And here's what I mean by that. History is really interested in what many of us have called the 5 C's, and they're listed here. Change over time, context, causality, contingency, and complexity. Some of these things are pretty easy to understand. Change over time, for example. Things were one way, they're now another. How did that change happen? What made it possible for that change to happen? Say, for example, you are somebody who was born not in El Paso, Texas, where I live. You were born somewhere else. A series of circumstances led you to move here to El Paso. Or once upon a time, what we now call the United States was a colony of the British Empire. Then it became a free country with its own government. Well, how did that happen? Context is this great way of figuring out what's going on at the time. Hey, if you're going to understand any sort of event, you have to understand the bigger picture. So, for example, last night when I recorded this video, I'm recording this video now, but the night before I recorded this video, there was a football game between the Bills and the Kansas City Chiefs. And it was a crazy game. A lot of people said it was the best football game they've ever seen in their lives. Incredible. If we just looked at the responses of a few individuals, we may not know why that's important. But when we zoom out and we say, okay, why were so many people talking about this? We would come to the understanding, or we could look at the context and see that football is the most popular sport in the United States. And not only is it popular in the United States, American football is watched all over the world. But it's especially important to the United States. Causality is cause and effect. Very simple. What caused this? What were the consequences? Contingency is my favorite because it allows us to play on our historical playground just a little bit more. Contingency is recognizing that a series of choices had to be made in order for something to happen. So, for example, if we look at World War I, there were choices that human beings made that led to an escalation of tensions between empires, between colonies, and those decisions accumulated to the point where some Serbian nationals hatched a plot to kill Archduke Ferdinand, and that set off a whole chain of events. But we have to look at where those decisions were made, or when those decisions were made, why those decisions were made, how they were made, and really to understand the past. Now, this can get off track really quick. We can start thinking about the what ifs. So if you are a Marvel fan, for example, we know based on the TV show, the Disney Plus show, I should say, what if things change just a little bit, we get a whole brand new timeline. And things can get out of control in a historical sense because you start dealing with what are called counterfactuals, things that aren't true, but in another world or in, some other kind of context, they could be. That's where we start getting into speculation. That's not real history, but sometimes it's really fun. Lastly, complexity. Perhaps my favorite one after contingency. You could trade on these, honestly. And complexity is recognizing that events have a lot more layers than you think they do. The Revolutionary War, the fight between American patriots, quote unquote, and the British, makes it sound like there are two sides. There's the patriots, there's the British, there's no one in between, that it's black and white. What we have all come to know about the world is that nothing is black and white. Or one of my favorite Star Wars lines, only Sith deal in absolutes. History's way more complex than that. It is dynamic. There's so much to it. The American Revolution, for example. It's not as simple as patriots and the British. There are people who live in the colonies who support the British. There are people in the colonies who don't care about what these patriots or what the British are doing. They just want to live their lives. There are people who live on the margins of society. Slaves, for example. We have Native Americans in the American Revolution or around the American Revolution. Their experience is different. Their understanding, their view, so to speak, of the American Revolution is different. And if we really want to understand something as monumental as the American Revolution, we need to look at just how complex it is. That means taking on different perspectives, looking at different points of view. It makes it so much more interesting. Well, how do we do this? How do we navigate these 5 C's? And how do we know what we know? Well, the way we do things is we investigate primary sources. And primary sources, quite simply, are things that are produced, whether they're writings, they're oral stories, paintings, drawings, recordings, social media postings, during the time under study. So let's say we want to know something about 1970s pop culture, and we want to know something about the cultural attitude of the United States via the lens of film. Okay, we're going to look at movies, and we are going to try and understand what those movies say about American culture in the late 70s. Where would we look? Well, we'd watch a bunch of movies from the 1970s. We'd watch Star Wars, for example. I'd watch that more than a few times. But that could be a primary source. Journals, letters, pictures, political cartoons, all of these are primary sources. These are the ways that we can glimpse back into the past. They are our time machines, in a manner of speaking. And so what historians do is we try to read as many primary sources about the thing we want to know about in order to come up with an answer to our question. I want to know about X thing. Well, I'm going to try to find primary sources that help me understand that thing. And then I can make an argument about, let's say again, how 1970s film shaped the culture of the United States. I could say that Star Wars represents a fundamental shift in how people looked at the world around them, that it offered an escape in the midst of the crises of the 1970s. And I could use context to show what was going on at the time, and I could show the themes of Star Wars to help me make that argument. Maybe not be the best argument, but it's something that we could do. How do we form our research questions? Well, we have a general idea of what we're curious about. I'm curious about religion. I tend to ask about religious meaning in the past. But sometimes we need to understand the past a little bit better before we start looking for sources. So we read other people who have written about the thing that we are interested in too. So let's think of it this way. Let's say you're interested in George Washington. Actually, we spent too much time with the Revolution already. Let's change it just a little bit. Let's say you are interested in a man named Eugene V. Debs. If you don't know who Eugene Debs is, Google it. Google him. Or if you're in one of my classes, we'll talk about him a little bit later. There are tons of books written about Eugene V. Debs. You're not going to necessarily find them at Barnes & Noble, but if you go to an academic library, say at UTEP or NMSU, or let's say the University of Colorado at Boulder, you'll notice that there are a whole bunch of books on Eugene V. Debs. How can so many people write so many books about that same guy? Well, we ask different questions. That leads to different answers. And so if I want to know about Eugene V. Debs, I can go to the library, I can start reading a couple of the books to try to understand who he was. And that can help me formulate my question. And another thing that we can do is we can look at what people have said about the past, and we can challenge what conclusions they came up with. History is dynamic. Remember that. People look at the past, and even with the same evidence, come to different conclusions. And that's what makes it so interesting. Because we read these diverse perspectives, not just in the past, but in the present. And we can come to an understanding of the past that's so rich and complex, and it just makes my heart happy. It's so deeply interesting to me. And I'm hoping that it will, if it isn't already, become interesting for you. If you don't like history, give it a shot. But let me give you this one piece of advice. Always be willing to challenge your assumptions. Just because a teacher said something in the past doesn't mean it's your best understanding or our best understanding of a particular event or phenomenon. Even the stuff, again, if you're in one of my classes that I teach you, you should question. What's my evidence? Okay, here's your evidence. How did you come up with this argument? And when I show you the evidence and I show you the point, you might have a different interpretation. And that could lead to a completely different argument. And that's where the fun happens. So don't take the past for granted. Dig into it. Be open to what it has to show you. And I promise, I absolutely promise, that history will never let you down. It'll bug you It will make you sad. It will make you full of joy. It will make you worry about the future of humanity in a whole different way. But you'll enjoy it. It won't let you down. It will cease to be boring. I promise it's the case. So here's where I wrap up, folks. It's a half an hour long talk about what we do, but I hope you found it interesting. And I hope it gets you excited to dig into the past and really find out how you fit in to this great and tragic and wonderful thing that we call history. I'll see you all in the next video. Take care.